Welcome to Battleground, where we're tracking this election through the voters who will decide this race in each of our 7 swing states. On this Labor Day 2024, the fight for union voters. Why both campaigns see union votes as a key to winning in swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada. We'll get the latest from Detroit. Then, how the issue of crime is playing out in the swing states. A closer look at how voters perceive crime versus what stats say about the crime rate. Plus, how the most recent census has reshaped the electoral maps in many of our swing states, and why population shifts could be a big deal in a close election. I'm Cupp, and with 63 days left until this election, this is Battleground.
And each and every one of you, thank you for the privilege of walking that picket line with you last year. Thank you for allowing us to lift up our voices. And in Minnesota, the work that you did, it didn't just benefit UAW workers, it benefited all workers.
Tim Walz making his pitch to auto workers in Michigan. Both campaigns are making multiple campaign stops aimed at working class Americans. In 3 of our swing states, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, that means union voters, with nearly 15% of the workforce in each state comprised of union members. That's a lot of potential votes. For more on the swing state battle for union voters, I'm joined by Todd Spangler, who covers politics for the Detroit Free Press. Todd, good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
It's no accident, Todd, that Kamala Harris will be in Detroit on this Labor Day, courting union voters. What is her pitch to union voters so far in this campaign, and do you think it's working?
The pitch is pretty clear. First of all, it's to continue the pro-union agenda that the Biden administration has had since it came in. Pushing for more expansion of organizing rights and walking the picket line, Biden becoming the first sitting president to ever walk a picket line before with the UAW. Another part of this is trying to remind union members that the Democratic top of the ticket looks more like them with Tim Walz and with some of Harris's working class background than the top of the Republican ticket. Finally, I think the big selling point here is just the level of enthusiasm that you're seeing with Democratic voters overall for the Harris campaign versus that lack of that enthusiasm for Biden before.
And Todd, to the Teamsters Union, which has a robust membership, we remember that their president spoke at the RNC and he was sort of snubbed by the DNC. Do you still expect the Teamsters to endorse Harris, or is that up for grabs?
I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Teamsters don't endorse in this race. Some of these other industrial unions have clearly moved ahead and just embracing Harris, embracing the Democratic ticket. But for the Teamsters, that's a little harder because I think they've got a larger part of their membership that is a little more conservative and wants to support Trump.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Teachers' unions also make up a reliable voting bloc in most of our swing states, and they've traditionally backed Democrats. Is that still the case?
Absolutely, without question, 100%. I mean, not 100% of the vote, but I mean, it's yes. There's the teachers' unions are absolutely going to be a big part of the Democrat push in the fall. And again, a big reason for that is not just that the Democrats have aligned themselves with the teachers' unions for decades now, but that, again, Harris gives them a chance, or at least a feeling of a chance to win that they didn't have with Biden.
Yeah.
And that enthusiasm is going to explode, especially among women. And you see a lot more women in teachers' unions than you do in some of these other unions we're talking about.
Yeah, good point. Finally, Todd, we know that union membership has been on the decline over a generation. How would you describe the state of labor, especially in some of our key swing states?
Yeah, I mean, actually longer than a generation, right? I mean, it's been declining for probably 20 years, 30 years, been dropping sometimes precipitously and sometimes, a little more slowly.
Yeah.
That said, in terms of public opinion of unions, it's way up. I've seen a Gallup poll here within the last week or so that suggests that 70% of people in the U.S. have a favorable opinion of unions. That's higher than it's been since the 60s. And there have been some wins. The UAW had a successful strike against the Detroit automakers. The railroads had a successful strike. The Writers Guild came out of their strike.
Right.
There have been a couple of job actions that have paid off. And that comes after the real gains that workers began to see post-pandemic. And as that started to change, you saw a lot of union leaders who did not want to go back and were not going to go back. And I think that's what's driving some of this. So you do see more public opinion in favor of unions than it had been for decades. But that hasn't translated yet into actual more union members.
Yeah. Todd Spangler with the Detroit Free Press. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, is crime on the rise, or do we just feel that way? How that issue is playing out in our swing states. Battleground will be right back.
I think the auto workers are going to vote overwhelmingly for Trump because they realize that we need a good business leader, and a good business leader creates jobs.
The auto workers tend to, at this stage, be more Republican.
I think the Democrats do represent working people in this country. I think Joe Biden's record and Kamala Harris with him, their record in supporting working people is very strong.
According to her own administration statistics on crime victims, Kamala Harris has presided over a 43% increase in violent crime. These are government numbers, by the way, including 58% increase in rape, 89% increase in aggravated assault, and 56% increase in robbery.
Welcome back to Battleground. Crime and public safety rank as important issues in all 7 of our swing states, something the Trump campaign highlights frequently during his Battleground visits. But in many of our swing states, violent crime is actually down. Take Phoenix, for example. In a recent deep dive on crime from Axios, they point out that homicides have decreased by 32%, as well as a drop in other crimes like rape and aggravated assault. But in many of our battleground big cities, residents don't perceive crime to be down. And therein lies the problem for our candidates. Russell Contreras is the senior race and justice reporter for Axios and the author of the Axios Latino newsletter. Russell, good to have you here.
Thanks, SC. How you doing?
Good. So first of all, terrific reporting on this issue. Let's start with how people feel about crime versus actual crime statistics. Why do we often have such a disconnect between how we feel and the real crime rates?
People can look at the stats of crime, whether they come from the city, the federal government, or a nonprofit organization, and not feel that's accurate depiction. And the reason why is there's violent crime and then there are property crime.
Yeah.
So while police may say, look, violent crime is going down on these categories, people may see a rise in property crime, that is auto thefts, burglaries. And so they don't necessarily differentiate the two. They'll say, look, I'm hearing my car got broken into the other day, my neighbor's car got... Crime is still a problem because of the opiate crisis. And so they'll connect the two. But in general, what we're seeing is a steady decline in violent crime overall. And that doesn't necessarily dent the perception of how people feel safe in their own communities.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't feel safe walking around at night in a city like Philadelphia, where I am, or New York or DC, the numbers don't really, impact you as much as that feeling that you are unsafe. I'll point out a number of high-profile Democratic mayors and AGs lost their re-elections over the past few years because voters thought they were soft on crime. How worrisome should that be for Kamala Harris?
It should be worrisome because it shows that regardless of policies, regardless of the numbers, it's all about perception. It's all about narrative. So Kamala Harris does have a history. We did some investigating of her stats and her record as AG. And what we did find is when she first came into office as Attorney General, violent crime did go down across the state. Now, she has very limited pull as Attorney General, but she could institute policies and so forth. So she does have a record at fighting violent crime. She also wrote a book that often gets overlooked in 2009 when she was a relatively unknown district attorney in San Francisco, where she talked about restorative justice. And she actually took to task the left and the right about fighting crime, saying, we look at this a different way. Locking them up and throwing away the key isn't going to solve the problem, but also not holding people accountable if they do break crimes. If they are have sort of addiction, held them accountable for that crime, but put them in a program where they don't repeat. They're not repeat offenders. She was at the time very different and very forward thinking at the time. She has not given us a clue of where she would do differently, but if we look at the record, shows some intrigue there.
Interesting, yeah. And what I know, and speaking to voters, is they just don't want to be told that crime isn't real. In Arizona, let's go over to the other ticket. Donald Trump talks a lot about crime and immigration, essentially linking the two. But is that how voters see it?
Voters may see that because of the way it's framed, but the stats and the narrative tell a different story. If you live along the border, whether it's South Texas, the border towns in Arizona or even in California, New Mexico, crime in these border towns is very low, especially violent crime. When you compare, say, the crime stats of border towns with the same size city in the interior, it's vastly different. I looked at numbers, say, like in 2020. I looked at the murder rate in, say, El Paso, Texas. It was 4%. If you consider El Paso as the same size of Memphis, the murder rate there was 44%.
Wow.
Largely different. McAllen, Texas, 2%. Yeah. Kansas City, Kansas, 36%. Del Rio, 3%. Lima, Ohio, same size city, 30%. Yeah. So the numbers don't add up. It seems like the perception is immigrants create crime. That's not the case. Now, you can't point to individual cases where an undocumented person may have committed a crime, a horrendous crime, and that gets blown up. But that's just as unfair of me to saying, you know, a dude from Appalachia committing a crime in Linden, Tennessee, therefore we should ban all Appalachians. It's not the same. It's not fair.
Right. I mean, we know that politics is perception, so this will continue to be an issue that both candidates just have to wrestle with in their communications with voters. Russell Contreras from Axios. Terrific reporting, Russell. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
For more on all of this, visit us at battlegroundnews.com or click on the QR code here. You can sign up for our newsletter, download our interactive swing state map, and find our social media links. And if you miss an episode, that's all right. You can catch up on YouTube or through our podcast. Up next, what the census can tell us about all 7 of our swing states in November. Battleground will be right back. In many ways, it's the key to winning in November, but doesn't get a whole lot of attention. The census. This coming election is the first since the release of the 2020 census, which of course not only counts all Americans every 10 years, but also has a significant impact on our demographic makeup, especially in our swing states. For more on a few specific examples of how census changes could play a major role on this year's election, I'm joined by Louis Jacobson, a contributor for U.S. News and World Report and senior author of the American Almanac of Politics. Louis, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, so before we dive into some specific swing states and really swing counties, explain why the changes in the census can play such an important role in this election.
If you put it simply, most of the faster growing states right now are red, and most of the slower growing states are blue. If you play this out for a decade, then Texas would gain 4 electoral votes, Florida would gain 3, Idaho, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Utah would gain 1 each. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, California would lose 4 seats, New York would lose 3. There's a bit of a silver lining for the Democrats. A lot of the population growth we're seeing is actually from folks leaving blue states and going to red states. So this is feeding more blue-leaning voters into some of the Sun Belt states and perhaps leading to a longer-term flip possibility. This sort of thing's already happened in Arizona and Georgia, which were solidly Republican states for a long time. Joe Biden won them both in 2020, very tight for 2024, of course, and it's possible that Trump could win them back. But they're definitely competitive, which they weren't before. So it's possible that some of this Democratic shift from the blue states to the red states could have an impact further down the road.
You cite 3 areas in 3 of our swing states that you think illustrates your point. Let's start with a county we reference a lot on this show, Maricopa County, Arizona. What's going on there in terms of the census changes?
It's got several key demographic groups politically. It's got a lot of Hispanics. It's got a lot of moderate suburban Republicans, and it's got a lot of senior citizens. Those are groups that are really up for grabs. In recent elections, a lot of the moderate Republicans are tending to shift over for the Democrats when there's a Republican who's nominated who is further to the right.
Okay, staying out west, and another county we hear a lot about, Clark County in Nevada. Walk us through what's going on there.
Clark County includes Las Vegas, and it's home to about 3/4 of the Nevada population. So it's the single biggest factor in winning the state. Clark County is very diverse. It's about 39% white, 33% Hispanic, 14% black, and 11% Asian. It's got a larger share of foreign-born residents, 22%, compared to the U.S. as a whole, which is 14%. and actually a slightly smaller share of senior citizens. These are all, key groups for just sort of building a winning coalition for either party.
Now to North Carolina and the key area of Wake County. Why is that so important?
Wake County is home to the state capital, Raleigh. And it's the most populous county in North Carolina. It's got an extremely high level of educational attainment. It's got 56% of residents there have a bachelor's degree, and the national rate is 34%. And the household income is 29% higher than the national level. So you've got, affluent, well-educated people in Wake County who are a group that has been definitely trending Democratic. The state is still very competitive and actually still leans slightly red. Basically, what's been happening in North Carolina is the urban and suburban areas have becoming more and more blue over time, but the rural areas have become more and more red over time. And it's in this sort of, kind of almost delicate balance where they're kind of growing at the same rate and shifting at the same rate. And so you're seeing a very competitive state, but one where the Democrats can't quite yet guarantee that they can win the presidential or Senate races.
Thanks. And for more on this and all things Battleground, visit us at battlegroundnews.com, where you can sign up for our daily newsletter, access our interactive swing state map, visit our social media sites, and give us feedback on the biggest issues of the 2024 race. Battleground, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Battleground. Years ago, there was an old adage that people didn't pay attention to presidential politics until after Labor Day. Well, that's inconceivable in our world of social media, cable news, and a news cycle that runs like a 24/7 hamster wheel. And so as we close in on 2 months until this election, it's worth remembering history has shown that a lot can happen between Labor Day and Election Day. For more on this, I'm pleased to be joined by Brian Rosenwald, political historian at the University of Pennsylvania. Brian, so good to have you here.
It's great to be with you, Essie.
Okay, so before we get into some great history, I wanted to get your take on the race here in Pennsylvania. What's your assessment? How's it going for both candidates?
Well, it's nip and tuck, and really it's going to turn on one thing. Who gets their regions out more? For Trump, that means the rural areas. Drive turnout up. It means the areas, Scranton, the old industrial towns that have moved rightward. Getting the turnout up there, and it means just nipping in a little bit into Harris's base, the Philadelphia suburbs, South Central Pennsylvania, Lancaster, York has moved leftward, so it's making sure that the margins are good there, and then maybe having low turnout in Philadelphia. For Harris, it's the opposite. Drive turnout up in Philadelphia, run up her margin in the Philly burbs, maybe make gains in Harrisburg and Lancaster and those areas, and then just cut a little bit into the rural regions, sort of like Joe Biden did instead of Hillary Clinton.
Right, okay. You also talk about something that I think is really important. There used to be a lot more states that were considered swing states, and they were different states. We're at 7 right now. Why does that matter?
It matters because when there were 20, first of all, the candidates were spreading attention all over the place.
Yeah.
And also, there wasn't as narrow a focus on each individual region. They weren't pinpointing things. The message had to be broader. They had to appeal to more people,
right,
because there were different types of states. You could have Kentucky could be in play at the same time that, say, Rhode Island was in play. So
right,
you couldn't just narrow cast and play to your base.
Yeah.
So that's changed our politics.
Well, it has. I mean, both candidates and both campaigns are just so granular now. They are looking at peeling off handfuls of voters.
Believe me, you can't watch a Phillies game for more than like a half inning without seeing 12 ads, and that's been that way since April.
So true. Okay, as we know, a lot can happen in politics in 2 months or even 2 weeks, but what are a couple of historical references for races that changed fairly dramatically between Labor Day and Election Day, starting with what became the most famous political newspaper front page in American history?
Dewey defeats Truman. The polling was in its infancy. There weren't a lot of polls. Everyone thought Thomas Dewey was going to win in 1948.
Yeah.
And the end result was that it was a shocker. But Truman went on the offensive. He went and got aggressive, and he won. Hubert Humphrey came back. He didn't win, but he came back from a lot down on Labor Day because he split from Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam. Jerry Ford came back big time. He got helped by the fact that Jimmy Carter did a Playboy interview, and it didn't go well when it was released in September.
They usually don't.
No, that's not a good way when you're running for something.
Yeah.
But realistically, it's the old, what we used to call an October surprise.
Right.
Either a change in direction in a campaign or something that shocks the system. It's different now in that people by the beginning of October in all of the battleground states will be voting.
Yeah.
And that is a big change. But, so it has to happen faster. But these races can change dramatically. Even in 2000, George W. Bush, the news of his DUI came out the week before the election, and Al Gore made up a lot of ground in that last week. So,
well, and now it feels like there's been a January surprise, a February surprise, a March surprise, an April surprise, right? I mean, surprises all around.
Don't count on anything. And I think you're right that there are still people who don't tune in until Labor Day.
Yeah.
But don't think we know what's coming, because it's totally variable. The lesson of the last few cycles should have been anything can happen.
You heard it. That's exactly right. That's the advice. Brian Rosenwald from the University of Pennsylvania. So great to have you here.
My pleasure.
And that's it for now. I'm Cupp. See you next time here on Battleground.